selling salvation for votes. The political and economic exploitation of Jesus in American traduction. The sacred and the secular entwined few figures in human history command as much symbolic power as Jesus of Nazareth. For over 2 millennia, he has represented hope, redemption, sacrifice, and love. In the United States, however, his image has often been transformed from a theological cornerstone into a political and economic tool. Campaign slogans invoke his name, churches become platforms for political mobilization, and media empires turn his teachings into profitable spectacles. This phenomenon, the selling of salvation for votes, illustrates the complex and at times troubling intersection of faith, commerce, and politics in American life. This essay examines how Jesus has been appropriated for political and economic purposes in the United States. It explores the historical roots of religious politics, the rise of evangelical power, the role of televangelists and prosperity preachers, and the transformation of Jesus into a brand that secures both profits and ballots. At its heart lies a critical question. When salvation becomes a political commodity, what is lost in the integrity of both faith and democracy? Historical roots. Religion and the birth of American politics. Religion has shaped American politics since the nation's inception. The Puritans who settled in New England envisioned their new society as a city upon a hill, a beacon of divine providence. Their covenant theology linked obedience to God with the success of the community, creating a foundation for political religious integration. The Declaration of Independence, though secular in language, invokes a creator who endows rights. Early presidents like George Washington and John Adams frequently referenced providence in public speeches. Christianity thus became woven into the civic fabric, not merely as personal faith, but as a legitimizing force for political authority. By the 19th century, revivalist movements, especially the Second Great Awakening, fused moral cause as abolition, temperance, suffrage with religious fervor. Jesus became a political actor by proxy, invoked in speeches that sought to reform society in his name. The precedent was clear. Religion could mobilize people, and politicians recognized the utility of Jesus as a symbol of righteousness aligned with national aspirations. The Cold War and the sanctification of American politics. The 20th century elevated this intertwining to new heights. During the Cold War, American leaders framed the conflict against the Soviet Union not merely as a geopolitical struggle, but as a holy war between Christian freedom and atheistic communism. President Dwight Eisenhower famously declared, "Our government makes no sense unless it is founded on a deeply felt religious faith, and I don't care what it is." In this era, "In God We Trust" was placed on currency, and "Under God" was inserted into the Pledge of Allegiance. These acts symbolized a deliberate fusion of faith and nationalism. Politicians found that aligning themselves with Christianity, and by extension Jesus, provided a moral high ground in the ideological battlefield. Yet this sanctification of politics also marked the beginning of commodifying Jesus for strategic advantage. Religious imagery became campaign material, churches became rallying points, and the sacred was woven seamlessly into the machinery of the state. 3. The rise of the evangelical voting bloc. The 1970s and 1980s witnessed the birth of the religious right, a coalition of evangelical Christians mobilized around issues such as abortion, school prayer, and traditional family values. Figures like Jerry Falwell, through the moral majority, transformed religious conviction into organized political power. Jesus was rebranded as a conservative culture warrior, invoked in opposition to secularism and liberal social policies. Political candidates who align with evangelical leaders gained access to a loyal, mobilized, and financially generous voting bloc. Churches became arenas not just of worship but of campaigning. Salvation and citizenship blurred as politicians promised to defend Christian America in exchange for votes. This era institutionalized the practice of selling salvation for votes. The moral authority of Jesus was strategically harnessed to influence elections, cementing a pattern that persists into the present day. IV, televangelism, and the business of faith parallel to political mobilization was the explosion of televangelism. Figures like Pat Robertson, Jim Bakker, and later Joel Osteen mastered the art of broadcasting faith to millions of Americans. These ministries were not merely religious outreach. They were businesses generating enormous profits through donations, book sales, and merchandise. The televangelist formula was simple: equate faith with material blessing and frame donations as an investment in divine favor. Viewers were promised healing, prosperity, or salvation in exchange for financial contributions. Jesus became less a savior of souls and more a guarantor of wealth and success. Politicians quickly recognized the influence of televangelists, courting their endorsements to gain access to their vast audiences. Campaigns partnered with religious broadcasters who delivered messages that blurred the line between spiritual exhortation and political propaganda. Salvation was literally marketed on television, in donation envelopes, and in voting booths. The prosperity gospel and political parallels. The prosperity gospel epitomizes the commodification of Jesus, its central message that God rewards faith with financial success, resonates with the ethos of the American dream. Preachers proclaim that Jesus desires wealth and health for believers, provided they sow financial seeds into ministries. This theology dovetails neatly with political rhetoric promising growth, success, and national greatness. Both rely on aspirational narratives that link virtue to prosperity. Politicians and preachers alike frame their message as one of empowerment. Believe, invest, and reap blessings, whether in heaven or in the marketplace of democracy, by packaging Jesus as a guarantor of material success. Prosperity preachers and their political allies reduce the complexities of faith to a transaction. Spirituality becomes consumerism, salvation becomes a slogan, and voting becomes a down payment on divine favor. Vie Jesus as a campaign symbol from Ronald Reagan. Its invocation of a nation under God to George W. Bush's declaration of being born again. Jesus has become a campaign staple. Donald Trump's courting of evangelical leaders, despite personal contradictions with Christian ethics, demonstrates the enduring power of aligning with Jesus for political legitimacy. Campaign rallies often feature overt religious imagery, Bibles held aloft, crosses on banners, and speeches laced with references to divine providence. Political candidates cast themselves as defenders of Christian civilization, implicitly or explicitly suggesting that a vote for them is a vote for Jesus himself. The ballot box, in this framing, becomes a confessional booth. To support a candidate is to profess allegiance not only to a political agenda, but to a religious identity. Jesus is sold as a reason to vote, transforming him into a partisan mascot. VII churches, as political platforms churches, once primarily spaces of worship, have, in many contexts, become political headquarters. Pastors endorse candidates from pulpits, host rallies, and distribute voter guides that frame political choices as moral imperatives. Non-profit tax exemptions for churches, intended to preserve religious independence, often mask vast financial networks that fuel political campaigns. Millions of dollars flow through church-affiliated organizations, blurring the boundary between religious giving and political financing. In this environment, salvation is leveraged as a form of political capital. Congregants are urged to see their vote as an extension of their faith, binding eternal destiny to partisan loyalty. The pew becomes indistinguishable from the polling station. VII. The economics of holy dollars beyond votes. The invocation of Jesus generates enormous economic value. Christian publishing, music, merchandise, and conferences form a multi-billion-dollar industry. Politically aligned ministries solicit donations that rival corporate PACs. Campaigns sell religious-themed memorabilia from Jesus Saves America. Hats to crosses emblazoned with slogans. Jesus has become a brand, marketable across platforms and profitable for those who wield his name effectively. This commodification serves both economic and political agendas. Donations, fund campaigns, merchandise spreads, messages, and the blending of faith and commerce reinforces loyalty to religious political identities. The business of salvation is not merely about saving souls. It is about monetizing belief. In this sense, votes are another form of currency exchanged in the marketplace of faith, novenen, culturelle consequences. Division and disillusionment. The commodification of Jesus has profound cultural consequences. First, it fosters polarization by tying salvation to partisan politics. Opponents are demonized not merely as political rivals but as enemies of God. National debates become holy wars, and compromise becomes betrayal of the faith. Second, it breeds cynicism and disillusionment. Younger generations, observing the blending of faith with commerce and politics, increasingly reject institutional religion. Studies show a sharp rise in the religiously unaffiliated, or knowns, many of whom cite hypocrisy and political entanglement as reasons for departure. In selling salvation for votes, churches and politicians may win short-term gains, but risk long-term alienation from the very faith they claim to defend. Jesus becomes less a universal savior and more a tribal brand, losing moral authority in the process. X. Theological critiques. What would Jesus say? Theologically, the commodification of Jesus stands in stark contrast to the gospel accounts. Jesus repeatedly condemned the pursuit of wealth, challenged the powerful, and identified with the poor and marginalized. His message centered on love, humility, and justice, not on financial gain or political dominance. Critics argue that selling salvation for votes distorts Jesus' teachings, turning him into a mascot for nationalism and capitalism, rather than a prophet of compassion. The prophetic role of the church to speak truth to powers compromised when the church itself becomes a political actor. From this perspective, reclaiming Jesus requires disentangling him from the machinery of profit and power, restoring him to the radical, countercultural role he played in history. She toward a different vision of faith and politics. Despite these distortions, there remains hope for a healthier relationship between faith and politics. Many Christian leaders and communities emphasize social justice, care for the poor, racial reconciliation, and environmental stewardship issues rooted in Jesus. Teachings yet often overshadowed by partisan agendas. A different vision sees faith not as a commodity, but as a moral compass guiding civic engagement. It resists the temptation to sell salvation for votes and instead calls for integrity, humility, and service. In this vision, politics becomes a realm for embodying values of compassion and justice, not a platform for exploiting sacred symbols. Conclusion. Counting the cost of selling salvation, the selling of salvation for votes represents one of the most striking paradoxes of American religious life. A figure who overturned tables in the temple has been invoked to raise funds for campaigns. A teacher who declared "Blessed are the poor" has been marketed as a guarantor of wealth. A savior who proclaimed a kingdom not of this world has been drafted into partisan battles. This commodification of Jesus may deliver ballots and dollars, but it comes at a cost: the dilution of faith, the distortion of democracy, and the erosion of moral credibility. Ultimately, the challenge for America is to ask whether it will continue to market Jesus as a political and economic tool, or rediscover him as a moral guide who transcends partisan divides. The stakes are not only religious but civic, the integrity of both. Faith in democracy depends on resisting the temptation to sell salvation for votes.